Today in Research Methods, we will be talking about multicultural considerations in research ethics. First, it's really important that we discuss what our terms mean. When we're talking about racial ethnic diversity in the United States in psychology, you'll often hear terms like culture, race, ethnicity, and while we often throw these words around, we don't usually stop to make sure we're all on the same page about what they mean. So here, when we say culture, we're referring to belief systems and value orientations that influence customs, norms, practices, and social institutions, including psychological processes and organizations. Race, on the other hand, is socially constructed. It's more abstract, more arbitrary, rather than biologically determined. It's a category that's assigned on the basis of physical characteristics, so phenotypic characteristics, and the generalizations and stereotypes made as a result. You'll sometimes hear people who, just drawing from US history or really global history, will describe race as a construct that was used by people who had power to disenfranchise those on the margins. So race and power really go hand in hand, and race was conjured up to facilitate oppression and oppressive use of power. Ethnicity, on the other hand, is the acceptance of the group mores and practices of one's culture of origin and the associated sense of belonging. So it's sort of claiming a culture, a cultural group, or a nationality. And those were definitions from the APA from 2002. So APA guidelines on multicultural education, training, research, practice, and organizational change for psychologists talk about two main areas. One is commitment to cultural awareness and knowledge of self and others. So the first guideline associated with that is that psychologists are encouraged to recognize that as cultural beings, they may hold attitudes and beliefs that can detrimentally influence their perceptions of and interactions with individuals who are ethnically and racially different from themselves. So that's a mouthful, but we're really just saying that psychologists are susceptible to experiencing, or rather enacting bias, both implicit and explicit, and also racism and prejudice, discrimination. So guideline 2, psychologists are encouraged to recognize the importance of multicultural sensitivity and responsiveness to knowledge of and understanding about ethnically and racially different individuals. So psychologists are meant to appreciate and really understand the implications of multiculturalism, of race and ethnicity, and be sensitive to those differences and responsive to them, because each individual has particular needs that may be associated with their experience as a member of a given race or ethnicity. Now, under the category of education, we've got a third guideline. As educators, psychologists are encouraged to employ the constructs of multiculturalism and diversity in psychological education. So we're meant to really take advantage of the asset that we have in a diversity of cultures to enrich education of psychologists, as well as to make sure that as we're educating people who will enter the field, that they are emerging as culturally competent individuals. Now, under research, which is most relevant to us as students in a research methods course, we have guideline 4. Culturally sensitive psychological researchers are encouraged to recognize the importance of conducting culture-centered and ethical psychological research among persons from ethnic, linguistic, and racial minority backgrounds. This can be interpreted in a number of ways, but perhaps a good takeaway is that we ought to be producing research that is not just geared towards a majority racial group or culture, but instead encompasses all the diversity that we have. And if we're talking about research in the U.S., that we have in the U.S., we should be producing research, producing evidence-based, empirically supported treatments that are geared towards not just white people. I'm saying white people because that tends to be the folks that comprise the majority of samples in psychological research, but research that has been demonstrated, pardon me, treatments that have been demonstrated to be helpful for people who are of African descent or who are Asian or Latinx or whatever. So we should not have studies that are just for one type of person. Um, and the same can be said for other kinds of diversity too. Thinking about gender, sexual orientation, uh, disability. Um, so that's research. Now, under practice, psychologists are encouraged to apply culturally appropriate skills in clinical and other applied psychological practices. So, really meant to be culturally competent clinicians. And then guideline 6 here, organizational change and policy development. Psychologists are encouraged to use organizational change processes to support culturally informed organizational development and practices. So this means that as we're shaping organizations, and this largely applies to folks who are in industrial and organizational psychology, we want to be shifting organizations towards being healthier environments for not just white individuals, but also individuals from Black, Indigenous, or other communities of color. And I think that it's a little ironic that this is one of our guidelines because even in psychology, if you're looking at journals, psychological journals, you'll have people who are in positions of influence like editors or reviewers who are predominantly white. And so there's a need for shifts in this discipline too, organizationally, to make sure that we are holding the priorities of individuals of color in the research that we're producing and in other things that we're producing as psychologists. So, multicultural ethical commitment is a term that you'll see in the APA ethics code, and it's just stating that a psychologist needs to be aware and do the following to maintain a multicultural ethical commitment, to demonstrate their commitment to multiculturalism. Some of these things include critically examining moral premises in the discipline that may largely reflect Eurocentric conceptions of the good. So just checking our values because our values are coming from somewhere, and oftentimes the values that are cast as normative are Eurocentric and at the exclusion of other cultures that are not finding their origin in Europe. We need to question deficit and ethnic group comparative approaches to understanding cultural differences. So that means instead of when we're examining, maybe we're examining low income neighborhoods that are predominantly Black, are we talking about those neighborhoods just in terms of what they lack, or are we in our research and in the way that we're framing things and writing things, acknowledging the assets that are in those communities as well? And ethnic group comparative approaches, that might mean oftentimes in research you might see groups compared by race along some dimension, perhaps just one that's perhaps kind of taboo now, intelligence. Comparing racial groups based on intelligence is not very productive. And also when we're talking about race, sometimes there's no theory-driven reason to be comparing the racial groups. We're just capturing variance but without a theoretical reason to do so. And it would be better to instead think about, well, if I'm expecting to see differences across race, why might that be? Is it because there's some other factor that I really think is the source of that variance, like maybe differences in education or income or something that's more substantive and less arbitrary? Then instead make that your variable that you're comparing based on. We also want to address the reality and impact of racial discrimination in the lives of cultural minorities in our research and clinical work and other things. We want to recognize that socially constructed racial and ethnic labels can strip participants of their personal identity by responding to them only in terms of racial or ethnic categorization. We want to avoid conceptually grouping members of ethnic minority groups into categories that may not reflect how individuals see themselves. We want to engage in self-examination of how institutional racism may have influenced each psychologist's own role, status, and motivation to develop professional identities free from these influences. And we want to develop the flexibility required to respond to rapid cultural diversification and fluid definitions of culture, ethnicity, and race. So, not being static here as a discipline, but instead tailoring what we're offering to align with changes in how we understand culture, ethnicity, and race as a society, because hopefully we're progressing in our understanding. It's worth noting here that Fisher is Celia Fisher, and she is actually one of Fordham Psychology's very own. So that concludes our multicultural presentation, but we will move on to talk about IRB and consent forms in the next link.